Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. So, we have an honored guest today, and who has been actually an honored guest in our country, Oman, many years ago, and now an honored guest here again in our conference at Royal Holloway University of London at the BSRG meeting. And so, with us today is Professor Alastair Robertson, who is well known to have published this book. So we don't have the book, but we have a copy of the cover page. So it is the geology and tectonics of the Oman region, and he's the number one of the authors here. And so we would like to first of all say hello.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. And so first of all, to break the ice, we would like to make a brief introduction about yourself.
Well, yes, thank you very much for asking me to contribute in this way. I'm Professor of Geology at the University of Edinburgh, where I've been working for many years. I do teaching, I also do research, and most of my research is in the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, and for some time I had a particular focus on Oman, which was a very delightful time.
Okay. And we would like to then have a briefing about your academic career from its beginning up to the time it escalated to the journey of Oman.
Well, indeed, I was an undergraduate at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and then afterwards I went to do a PhD at the University of Leicester in England, and that was based on the geology, the sedimentary geology of Cyprus.
In Cyprus, at what year?
And that was finished, it started in 1971 and finished in 1975.
Okay.
And around that time, in fact, before I finished my PhD, I started a kind of junior lecturing position at the University of Cambridge.
Okay.
And it was during that time that I first began to take an interest in Oman. But by about 1977, I came back to Edinburgh with a permanent position. Teaching, and I've been doing teaching and research there ever since.
Since 1977?
Since 1977, indeed. And it was during that period of about 5 years after I was in Edinburgh first that I had the opportunity to visit Oman quite a number of times.
Okay. And so your visits to Oman were during which years?
Well, of course, I have to check my records, but I think the first visit was in 1978, and the visits were usually once a year in the winter, either December or in January, and they went on right till about 1986-87.
Okay.
And around about that time, we had quite a large conference in Edinburgh on Oman geology specifically.
Yes.
And this was joined by many specialists who've worked in that area for quite a number of years, of course, including Omani geologists. Although at that time there were not very many, it has to be said.
At that time, in the 80s.
Quite different now. And then we between us published this book. You referred to the geology and tectonics
of the
Oman region. This had a blue cover, and in Oman it's been known as the Blue Book.
The Blue Book, yeah.
And it's been used for the last 20 or 30 years.
We've seen old
by
copies
many
of
people.
it.
Yes.
And so this book was more of a combination of the works of that conference.
Yes, the conference was a focus to bring together quite a lot of the studies and to publish them. As far as how the work was carried out, at that time I had a link with the Open University in England. Professor Ian Gass of the Open University had a contract to do large a part of the mapping of Oman,
Okay.
especially around Jebel Akdar, the Ophiolites, up towards northern Oman, Dibazone, Musandam, and he had many PhD students, and in fact this was published by the Geological Society of London as a very well-known memoir in, I think, 1986. But then after that, quite a number of oil companies were interested in the area, especially Amoco. And they effectively sponsored quite a number of people to do field-based studies. And I was a part of that. And then I realized that so much had been done, we should try to bring it all together.
Bring it together into one book.
So that's what we did in this conference and the subsequent volume. Actually, after that, I continued my research mainly in the Middle East and other parts of the world. But I did go back to Oman for short periods of time for several of the conferences, two of the
special
conferences.
Events.
Yes, indeed. But the work was largely, therefore, carried out between 1978 and 1986.
Okay. And so they were intermittent visits rather than long-term stays.
Yes, all of this time I had a teaching job, so I was never able to spend or live in Oman. Unfortunately, I would have liked to.
It would have been a pleasure.
Indeed, thank you. It was always a matter of when I could get away from teaching, especially in the winter months when it was more suitable climatically. Then I would fly out and we would have a jeep and we would camp in the field and visit a number of areas. And I did have one PhD student called David Cooper. And he publishes in this book. And actually he has been back to Oman recently and is continuing work there.
Okay.
And another colleague of mine is Mike Searle, who's very well known for his work in Oman, and he's continued to work there more or less all the time until now.
Yeah, I think I met Mr. Searle.
Yes.
And so then you kind of took advantage of vacations at that time.
That's right. It was entirely in the vacations, so it meant that each time we made a limited amount of progress, but because the work continued for nearly 10 years, gradually we got more and more data. Really.
So from about 78 to 88, or even to the publication date of the book in 1990.
Yes.
Okay, so about 10 years of intermittent.
It was really 10 years of intermittent visits and research. But one of the things as I'm sure you know, as a geologist, every day you spend in the field, you generate maybe 10 days of work in the laboratory and follow-up work. Although the time in the field in Oman was not very great, there was a lot more time carrying out research, carrying out study of the rocks and the fossils, and of course preparing the publications. So during that time, a lot of my research was involved in Oman, even although the amount of time I could spend there was limited.
So over there you took advantage of the time to the field work.
Yes.
While the author work and the literature and so on was in the rest of the times.
Well, that's quite right. And one of the big advantages of working in Oman is that the exposure is, being a desert, arid environment, is very, very good indeed. So often in other areas you spend a great deal of time to find outcrops, to find suitable areas. But in Oman, where you have this wonderful exposure, everywhere you go you can find excellent information.
So it's kind of like outcrops everywhere.
Well, and sometimes it can seem too much. Sometimes it can be overwhelming because your time is limited, so you have to be very selective. You have to decide, we want to go here, we want to do this, and sometimes you can't see everything because there isn't time.
So it's so many outcrops that it's sometimes scattering attention.
Well, you have to be quite determined what your objectives are.
Depending
because
on
always you're finding new and interesting things. Excuse me, and that would be interesting, but you have to say, no, we're going to do this. And you go ahead and do it.
Okay, and so from the index of contents,
Yes.
we see that you focused mainly on the Tethyan evolution and
Yes.
that theme.
Well, that's right. I'm dealing with sedimentary rocks and in a tectonic environment. So in this book, I made with my colleagues an overview and synthesis of everything,
Yeah.
which is the first chapter. But it also had some particular interest in particular regions. Part of it was in the Dibba zone
Yeah.
in the United Arab Emirates.
Okay.
Also the Hatta zone,
Yeah.
which is in northernmost Oman, isn't it?
It's kind of to the border.
It's near the border, very near the
with
border.
the state of
And then further south, all the way down the west margin of the Jebel Akhdar, as far as the Sahatat area near Muscat.
Yeah, this
Yes, I didn't have a chance to work much south of Muscat, but everywhere in Oman, mainly to the north of Muscat, I was
mostly
able
the
to,
northern flank.
Exactly,
of the mountains.
And before that, when I was working with this Open University project, I particularly worked on the sedimentary rocks which overlie the ophiolite,
Okay.
and that was in the Sohar area, mainly
Sohar
Sohar area. And at that time, they were just making the highway. It was a very dirt road, and there was clouds of dust everywhere.
Okay.
And when the first time I went to Mutra, they were just starting to build it.
That highway that crosses from.
Well, the whole city of Mutra, they were just starting to build, and buildings all over the place.
Yeah.
And all the vehicles were Land Rovers.
Land Rover.
There were no other vehicles really.
No sedans.
No Japanese cars, and everything was a line of Land Rovers waiting to get into Mutra. Many building into Mutra, many buildings and delays because of roadworks, and everything was being built up.
So it was kind of an upspringing city at that time.
Yes.
And so there was also like excavation, particularly on the post-abduction sediments.
Yes.
For the road work.
Yes, that's right. Because the road is largely going through the tertiary shallow marine limestones.
The yellow ones.
And indeed, the yellow limestones and rocks near Matra. And also it was going over the river deposits, the Wadi gravels.
The Wadi, the alluvium.
Further north, the alluvium, yes.
Okay. And who are the notable personalities that you met in Oman?
Well, one of the main things, of course, we met many Omani people, and they were always very, very friendly and helpful. Everybody was very open and welcomed us and offered us tea, and it was very, very nice country to visit. Every time, without any exception, it was a delightful country to visit. But as far as the geologists out there were in the past very famous geologists, particularly Ken Glennie, who sadly died very, very recently. But he and his colleagues did this fantastic work, initial mapping of the Oman mountains in the late 1960s.
The late 60s.
So he was a tremendous personality. But I would particularly point out my friend and colleague Mike Searle.
Mike Searle also.
Who has been going many times to Oman.
Yes.
And people out there may well meet him now because he goes. And my former student, as I mentioned, we collaborated on this. Excuse me a moment. I mentioned his name before. Just have to.
Dr. Khalil?
No, another person who I particularly remember at the time was Samir Hanna.
Dr. Samir Hanna.
Dr. Samir Hanna he was from Egypt. He was a lecturer in Sultan Qaboos University, wasn't he?
Yes, until recently.
Many years. And he was a very enthusiastic field geologist.
Yes, that's
He was
right.
always taking parties out. He's very popular with the students, and he is outstanding geologist, certainly. But of course, in the more recent years, many Omani students have studied, and now they are leading the research in Oman. One Omani I worked with was Khalil al-Riami, but he was sponsored by Shell, but they said you can't do a PhD in Oman because you will work there later. You must do a PhD outside Oman.
Okay.
So he worked with me in the north of Syria.
In the north of Syria,
And,
so there, that's where he had his project.
And we had a very successful research project. And after that, he came back and he worked for the company for some years. And then he left and he joined another company. And I know he's very active in the Oman Geological Society. Is that right?
Yes, sometimes contributing.
Yes. So he's someone who I had a very close and long-standing link, and I always remember visiting him, and he invited us to visit his family.
His family.
And that was very nice.
In
really.
which town?
Well, it was near Ibri, I think.
Okay.
Yes, I think it was near Ibri. Yes.
And so and over there also, what stories are notable stories you remember from trips in the Oman mountains?
Well, I suppose that what I particularly remember in winter, the days are quite short.
Yes.
And so we would put up our tent. Sometimes I was working by myself, actually, sometimes with one other person. So at about 4:30 in the afternoon, we'd think we've got only 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
We have to find a camp place. We have to put up our tent.
It was getting dark.
And by 5 o'clock, completely dark.
Dark.
So you want it to be organized. And then quite a long night. But I suppose it was dark, coming light at 6 in the morning. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
later
so we would,
in the
or
morning,
even
then
later. So we would be getting up before it got light and having some breakfast and then going to the field. And as soon as it was light, we kept going all day.
All day from
From about hardly
sunset
any delay.
From sunrise to sunset.
To get the most of the time. And sometimes we had to drive from one wadi to the other. So you go out onto the Batina, and then you drive north, shall we say, and then you come another wadi to next place, because our time was always limited. So
time.
we didn't want to spend the time during the day driving. So sometimes we would drive up the wadis in the dark. It was a little bit dangerous.
So spend the night
and then camp,
the way
and then we would start in next morning. Sometimes it was quite cold at night as well.
Yeah, especially in the interior or on the
higher up
in the higher mountains.
And sometimes the weather was quite threatening. I remember the conference in Oman where we had the reception in the garden of Sultan Qaboos, and we had a huge rainstorm in the middle of the reception.
And it was one of those winter, I think.
Yes.
Winter weather conditions or winter depressions.
And many guests were there, and finally they had to abandon the reception because so wet.
Even though it's rare over there.
It was rare. We were very unlucky. But usually we were always a little worried because you can't be in the wadi floor if there's some heavy rain. So we always had to be careful to put the tent somewhere in a safe place away from the. Yes. So there were many other stories, but I have to admit that it's quite a long time ago.
It's been a long time, yeah, sure.
And probably if you gave me some warning in advance, I could tell more stories.
Yeah, would have been.
What I
maybe next time.
particularly remember is a very successful and enjoyable time spent out there.
Okay. And so at that time, the infrastructure was way less.
Yes, it was just the beginning, I would say, of the modern development. It was just going from the desert,
outcrops and
really
places.
quite a remote, if you like, desert environment with only dirt roads and Land Rovers, and there was just Muscat as a very small town. And for example, Smail Gap had no buildings, just ruins.
Just ruins of old towns.
And out in the desert front, near Jebel, there were really very few buildings, very small towns, and the people mainly were wearing traditional costumes.
Traditional clothes.
Men had their traditional clothes, and of course their swords. And this was quite normal, really.
Over there,
but
older generation.
Indeed, and they were just beginning to develop things, and that moved very, very quickly. The road to Sohar was half built when we arrived.
The paved road?
Yes, and after that it was just dirt roads.
Dirt roads.
Clouds and clouds of dust everywhere.
So the roads that were main roads that are now dual highways.
The very first asphalt was just being put down.
Yes. So it's like much harder to reach outcrops than it is now. Certainly.
Well, especially when we went up wadis, and I suppose many of these are still difficult to access.
Yeah, even now.
But they were very, very rough, and you needed to allow a lot of time and to be quite careful, really.
Okay.
But yes, so it was a time of transition. Some of my older colleagues saw it maybe 5 or 10 years earlier, when it was really before any modern development. But when I arrived, it was just beginning to be a modern
development. And towards the conclusion, what advice would you like to give to prospective students?
Yes, well, you mean Omani students in particular, I suppose. Well, I suppose that you grow up in a country and you may just take everything for granted because it's your home. But what you perhaps is useful to realize is it's a very special part of the world in many ways, culturally, but certainly geologically, and that it's in the geological understanding, it's a really critical area, and very, very distinctive features. But also, the work that was done around this earlier time produced a framework, but it left many problems unsolved. So for the young scientist using some modern ideas, modern techniques, there are tremendous opportunities in many areas, not only petroleum geology, but in many other areas, environmental geology and historical geology, and it's a very good opportunity for the future.
There's a lot still unexplored.
A lot still to be done.
Still to be done. Okay. So, and your well-known book is kind of one of the bases of.
Yes, it's one of the building blocks.
And a reference for students and academics even now.
Absolutely. Yes, I think so.
So thank you very much for your precious time, Dr. Alastair. Professor Alastair,
thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, and good to meet you, and
good to meet you too.
All the best when you go back to Oman for you and your family and colleagues.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very good.